Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we're going to do a really cool video. Shut up, I'm cool, you're not my real dad. Today we are returning to the subject of the UniFi UNAS Pro 8. We've already done a big review of this device, but as I mentioned in a few points in that video that we were going to really drill down into several factors about this device. I wanted the review to go out so I could get some recommendations, and today we are going to be looking at noise, power consumption, speed, and temperatures. Now, you may have noticed me glance down. There is absolutely no way I'm not going to be referring to these notes throughout the course of this video. It's not digital, it's not on an auto cue, so a lot of the time, if you see me sort of glancing down, that is because I've been writing up notes on this for the last 2 weeks during the course of my testing, and although there's going to be a lot of information thrown at you, I do think it's important we get some disclaimers out of the way. So again, there's chapters all the way along the bottom. If there's something specific about this device that you want to know, you can skip ahead. But for now, we do have to highlight several different things. Number one, throughout the course of this testing, I did not have this device in a rack-mounted cabinet. I made sure, at least in terms of the noise and the heat, that it was apropos on its own. It was important to do it that way because I think, although the numbers I'm going to be showing you today, not only down to the drives I choose to use, but also because some of you are going to be deploying this in different ways, and therefore the numbers are going to be reflective of your own setup. So I tried to remove as many variables outside of the system as possible. Also, you may notice throughout the course of bits and bobs of this video that underneath the system is another 4-bay, that is the UNAS Pro 4. There's going to be a review about that in the future, but it's just for this video, again, depending on when this is published. You're going to see it in shot, but I'm not going to feature that at all in this video. Next up, the drives I'm going to use were 8 TB drives that you can purchase from UniFi's own website. So keep in mind, particularly in terms of the performance numbers and the power consumption, that the results I'm going to show you are very reflective of the drives that I'm using in this video. And different drives, be they SATA SSDs or SATA hard drives, will have wildly different results. And although I do feature SSDs in this video as well, know that all of the drives I'm using are the drives that you get from UniFi's own website. UniFi, when you do buy their own drives, depending on the capacity, you end up either getting Western Digital HC320s or Toshiba MG class drives. These are 7200 large cache drives from WD and Toshiba respectively, but again, all the results are indicative of those drives if you bought them directly from UniFi. Also, when it comes to the 10G testing, I used 2 USB 4 10G adapters, where I used UniFi's own 10G to USB 4 adapter, and I used the QNAP variation as well. A little bit pricier, but largely the same protocol with the same controller inside there. Also, I'm using a Windows 11 system running off a Gen 4 SSD. A lot of the results you're going to see are domestic class results. It's really important. I could have gone for synthetic benchmarks, and again, I'm using synthetic benchmark tools, but I wanted to use more realistic systems. I could have gone some monster Ryzen 9 system, of which I've got several around here in the office, particularly the Minis 4 ones we've recently reviewed, but I didn't think that would be entirely fair. I wanted it to be domestic class PC use. If I'd used a Linux kind of custom build there, Ubuntu, if I'd used Mac as well, the results are going to differ. This is a Windows focused video. Apologies if that's not the operating system for you. And finally, throughout the course of this testing, I am going to be referring to different stats in terms of watts, in terms of decibels, and in terms of temperatures there. They will be shown on screen. Again, they might not be the ones that you use in your own region, or kilowatts per hour. Some people just want to factor watts. I can't facilitate for everyone, so keep that in mind. But with that enormous disclaimer out the way, let's crack on and start immediately with noise. Now, for the noise, I had the laptop connected to this device and for running different bits and bobs of the test, but I had deactivated the fans on both the GPU and the CPU of that laptop. There is no noise coming out of the laptop during the course of this testing, and the dBA measuring tool there that you can see is connected to one of these, a DJI mic, and that was being utilized to monitor the decibel level. But when you see me closing in or getting closer, that is the live microphone on the camera. So the dBA is being measured from the mic you can see on the table. Now, the first test I wanted to run was the system in idle. That was the system with the RAID resynchronization done and the fans being set to balanced mode. This system allows you to flexibly change the fan mode from balance, which is kind of an auto reactive mode, to low, where the fan's RPM is lowered significantly, to high or cooling mode, where it is particularly high there. And here's how things knocked out. With the system in idle, so the drive's waiting and the fans in balanced mode, we saw a noise level of 35 to 36 dBA. Next up, keeping the system in idle, I then went and set it to low RPM mode there, the quietest choice of the three in terms of setting up the fans on this rack mount metal system here, and we saw the general noise level around 32 to 33 dBA up and down. Do keep in mind, of course, as this is a rack mount system, this is pretty much all metal from the ground up, and that will be reflective. Also, you may notice there I have made sure to insulate the system top and bottom at least away from the 4-base system underneath, using that foam pad there. So hopefully that'll give you some idea about the noise that you're hearing is directly from the system itself. Next up, with the system remaining in idle, I set the fans to cooling mode, or max RPM, or turbo if you will. Now at this point, this is when you really get to know the difference between a rack mount and a desktop in terms of actual cooling systems here. We got the system set up with that max cooling, and immediately the sound level went up to a stonking 54 dBA. That is unworkable in close proximity, and again, why you'd expect a system like this to be locked away in a rack cabinet or in a server room. Again, those that wanted to know about noise levels on this rack probably are never going to use this system intentionally, because if you were asking about noise, it meant you're going to be in relative close proximity to it. Now, I'm sure some of you were wanting to know, what about when the drives were active? Now again, because of the different drives, the drives you choose to use are going to be different in terms of the output. More large capacity and more enterprise class drives generally make more noise as the actuator reads across the individual platters in the disk, with faster spin up and spin down and retrieval. However, once the fans were in cooling mode, as you can see here on screen, it didn't matter. The system being active was still drowned out by those fans. The fans, again, the dBA still registered around 54 dBA there. So listen to it now. You can't even make out the hard drive noise. But an interesting point of consideration some of you might want to know is that the power use of this system, once you activated those fans, actually added around 5 to 10 watts. The cooling system on this is actually pretty aggressive in terms of power consumption. So if you are going to set the fan to their highest value, or you're using the system enough for the auto system to kick in, keep in mind that power consumption will jump up around 5 to 10 watts using the highest grade of that fan cooling. But for now, let's actually talk about that power use in different scenarios. Now for power consumption, again, depending on how you deploy the device and the drive you use, power consumption is going to be wildly different there. So keep in mind that the results you're going to see are based on my own setup. Now, again, we had 8 of these hard drives in here. We had 8 of the Toshibas all in one setup. And alongside that, we had 2 2TB M.2 NVMe's inside. Now the M.2s were running as cache in both read and write for the hard drive RAID 5 array, and later on when you see the SSD testing, know that during the SSD testing the SSDs were on a RAID 5, but I wasn't able to use the M.2s for cache, and you can't use M.2 SSD for cache on SATA SSDs on this system, and also can't use these for storage boards, at least yet. I had the system connected to one PSU, even though I had 2 PSUs inside, I wasn't drawing power from both of them, and the system was run for 60 seconds well, the test I was doing was run for 60 seconds before I began the recording, and I only had one 10 gig NIC connected for each of these power tests. So let's crack on with the results. So number one, when we had all of the hard drives inside, with the hard drive sat in idle, ready to go, but not actually being accessed, and CPU at sub 10% utilization, we saw a stonking 84 to 85 watts power consumption, which is pretty darn high. We will get onto why that is in a moment. Next up, we put the hard drives into active operation. We went with read-write operation across the drives, and the CPU utilization, along with backup and other background operations, sat at around 50% utilization. And at that point, power consumption leapt up to 92 to 93 watts. And again, I know there are those of you watching this freaking out right now in terms of that power consumption. Wait for it, okay? Don't worry, wait for it. Next up, we went for the hard drives in active use again, with the CPU at around 50% active use again, and this time with that fan, as mentioned earlier on, the fan's cooling system set to maximum. And at that point, that's when we broke into triple figures. We got between 96 to 102 watts power consumption. It hit 102 when we went with the write operations to the system, and presumably the CPU working harder. Now, we will get onto the SSD results in a moment, but as a very quick side subject, we need to talk again about these drives, because these are the drives that UniFi have on their own website in terms of their own labelled or recommended drives, but the power consumption of these drives, as these are enterprise class drives, the power consumption per drive is actually pretty high. By the way, this extends to Seagate and other hard drive manufacturers as well, such as they are. The Toshiba MG series has a power consumption of around 8 to 10 watts, depending on write, read, hibernation and full standby. Whereas the WD HC320s, they have a power consumption around 8 to 12 watts there. Now, the system does have hibernation mode, so during true idle and true hibernation, it is probably going to come down lower. But we have to factor in that that is 8 hard drives with a potential draw of between 8 to 10 watts. Once you add that up, those numbers that I've just talked about, between 60 and 100 watts, we have to factor in that a huge amount of that power draw is from the storage media. So that was why we switched over to SSDs for a bit, because of the SSDs, the power draw on SSDs goes down exceptionally lower, sometimes as low as 1 watt, 2 to 3 watts in some cases. And hopefully we get a better reading on the system. So we repeated our test. So what we did was, during the RAID synchronization of the SSDs, that was kind of when the SSDs were kind of being used, but the system was also being used to a significant degree of between 30 and 50%. So mostly read and indexing within the system, and we saw a power consumption of 41 watts. That's 8 SSDs and the system running as before. Next up, we went with read and write activity on all of the SSDs simultaneously, with repeated 1 gig AJA testing over 10G. So one of the 10G NICs, of course, was working, and the CPU between 30 and 50%. And from there, it actually went down to 36 to 38 watts. It was actually lower than the synchronization of the original RAID 5 array. So, as we can see, if we compare those numbers against the hard drive numbers we just saw before, the difference between using hard drives and SSDs ended up sitting around 40 to 45 watts power delivery. So keep that in mind with this system. And particularly, again, it's a rack mount. We shouldn't be surprised. And I'm sure some of you have already taken to the comments to say, of course, it's heavy power use, it's a rack mount, and you're right. But not everyone has that information, do they? And it's good for us to be able to talk about it. So, right, you're hearing this and you're thinking, right, well, I should just fill this with SSDs. Right? Well, I'm going to say it right now before I even get to the results. Because of the base level hardware architecture of this system, 16 gig of RAM, a 4-core ARM A56 Cortex processor, even if it has multiple 10GBEs, this is not going to be able to leverage SSDs as much as you might hope. And spoiler alert, the SSD performance was better, but it wasn't miles better. But let's get on to the results. Starting out with the hard drives, again, Windows 11 environment. We went through it with the disclaimers there. With the hard drives there, running in the background, we did a simple 101 gigabyte SMB file transfer in Windows. It was 1,231 mixed files of every variety you can probably think of, from zips to PDFs to movies, photos and docs. And once we transferred it over, it took 4 minutes and 17 seconds over a single 10 gig connection there. Now, that averaged out at approximately 393 megabytes per second. Again, this is more real world than it is synthetic. Now, you would think with SSDs, it would be miles better, but it wasn't. When we used 8 SATA SSDs there, these are SanDisk SATA SSDs there, the same transfer of 101 gig, the same files, took 3 minutes and 52 seconds. That's not miles better. That's around 25 seconds better overall. And that averaged out, by the way, around 435 megabytes per second approximately to transfer that data over. That's only a difference with SSDs of around 42 to 45 megabytes per second. A total difference between them. That's not huge, and a lot of that is to do with bottlenecks in between. Again, if I was using a more optimized system, if I was able to muck around with the MTU, something not factored in, if I wasn't using SMB and I was using something like iSCSI, if I was using more consistent file format, if I was running a RAID 10 or a RAID 0, which by the way, RAID 0 isn't supported on this yet, the result is that the ways in which I could have manipulated that performance higher weren't really at my disposal, at least in terms of the test that I was running here. Now, from there we moved on to AJA testing. That is a repeated file test over and over again. Now, with AJA, I did a 256 megabyte, 512 megabyte, 1 gigabyte, and 4 gigabyte test there. So this is testing read and write. But for the case of argument here, we're going to refer to this as up and down because it makes way more sense and it's kind of flipped and counterintuitive in the way AJA presents the information on the client. So when I had the 8 hard drives inside, the peak performance I saw, so remember that's the highest, was 863 over 696. Again, not fabulous, but not terrible for 8 hard drives there. And again, that averaged out when we went through the charts that AJA spits out, and you can sort of process it as an XML, XLXS. From there, it averaged out around 598 over 530 there over the 10 gig. So it never fully saturated. I didn't think it would. But overall, all right numbers. But again, slightly synthetic. So when I switched over to the SSDs, yes, the numbers were higher, but it wasn't the peak of the number that interested me. It was the consistency of the number. As you can see, it's the same 4 tests running on AJA, and the peak numbers, I saw 890 over 720. So again, better, definitely better than they were on the hard drive, but not out of this world better. And it averaged out across their performance numbers much higher though, at 745 over 670. Now, why is that important? Because on the SSDs, you may have noticed during the course of the testing, they got higher more consistently. The SSDs and their response times, they were doing their job. It's all the bits in the middle of how the data is moving back and forth. So the SSD certainly gave me a more consistent performance number, and overall that's why the average is much, much higher, but the peak was only a little bit more than hard drives, because when the data needed to be handed to and from the SSDs, they did their job. But the architecture in between, because it is more efficient, that A57 Cortex, that's why the numbers, although consistent, were not massively higher. When I dug directly into the SSDs, I went into ATTO Disk Benchmark and did a 1 gigabyte test just on the SSD scenario, because by then I'd already disbanded the hard drives out of the system. We saw an ATTO read there, a peak of 784 megabytes per second read. We can actually say terms like read and write now. And then write, we saw 613. So again, good numbers and consistently within about 80 to 100 megs of the peak numbers across the board there. So decent enough, but again, it did kind of highlight to me that SSD deployment on this 8-bay, you're not really going to see a return on investment on SSDs inside this realistically, at least in terms of performance, although you would, of course, see it in power consumption. It's again hot in here. Let's talk about the temperatures. Let's go through some more cool stuff. Now, with this system, we looked at the temperature over the course of the test, and we only looked at the hard drive results, by the way. There was no point with the SSDs because very few people are going to deploy SSDs inside this, and also the amount of heat generated from SATA SSDs is so negligible that they would, compared to that of the heat generated from SATA hard drives, I thought we'd go with them as peaks to be representative of the bulk of users that are going to use this system. Now, As you can see in the images again, we got the little 4-bay underneath. That had been completely powered down and all the heat dissipated from it anyway. We just had the system ready to go. Remember, it uses horizontal cooling. There's no ventilation on the outside apart from on the front and the back. So as long as the front and the back aren't obstructed, we're absolutely fine. Now, as you can see there, on our 1 hour testing, you can see with the thermal imaging on screen, that was during 1 hour of repeated 1 GB AJA testing and the fan set to auto mode there. Now, the front of the system and the top panel sat around 26 degrees. And in the back where the PSU is located, or at least the PSUs, we could see the temperature getting a little bit closer to around 30 degrees there. Now, in the front panel between the hard drives, we could see temperatures of between 33 and 34 degrees, and at the rear at the ports and connections, that 10 gig NIC was clearly working quite hard for the better part of an hour over 10G, and it started getting around 41 to 47 degrees. Although I will say the fan assisted PSUs, the temperature wasn't that bad. It was only 28 degrees around those PSUs overall. So the temperatures when the system had been in operation and access for a long time are actually pretty darn good, even with the fans still at auto and not upping themselves to the maximum performance there at RPM. Now, after I did another test after that, where we set the system up again, but this time with all the hard drives inside, we ran it for 24 hours. But every hour, on the hour, we had a backup, a sync operation, and we had an upload, download taking place with snapshots on the system every hour. It took around 30 to 15 minutes each time, so it meant over the course of an hour, this is done, over the course of a day, it was done 24 times. So over the course of that 24-hour period, we saw the following. After that, I should say, we powered down the system and then immediately went and did our thermal testing as soon as the system powered down. So the fans were off, we left the power connected. Now the hard drives were the first thing that I removed. I wanted to see the hard drive temps, and they were at around 36 to 37 degrees across all of the disks. At the back of the system, we saw the ports actually dissipate quite a lot of heat, around 30 to 31 degrees around the ports and connections. And if we look through where the fans were, we can see that between the fans, the inside of the system was sitting at quite an impressive 34 to 35 degrees, with the outside external chassis sitting at around 30 to 31 degrees. Interestingly, once we peeked the camera inside, we saw the temperature of around 31 to 34 inside the system behind where the hard drives are on that main board. But what was really intriguing is, unlike my original testing of this system with the M.2s, they've definitely optimized the software. There's been 3 software updates since I set this up, and one of the things I saw that it was improved upon was the M.2 temperatures. The M.2s were only sat around 31 to 34 degrees, much lower than in my original review, and obviously this is because the tests only taking place per hour weren't hitting these especially hard. Overall, the temperatures of this rack mount were really, really good. Nevertheless, we've got to talk about CPU temperatures very briefly, because CPU temperatures, as it's an ARM processor, generally ARM-powered NASes, their CPUs can get very, very hot very, very quickly. ARM CPUs, think about your mobile device when you're running a few processors and you go, oh, that's pretty warm. That's not the battery, that's just the CPU inside. They're designed for small length code that's compressed code, unlike an x86 64-bit Intel or an AMD, big beefy CPU that can generally run more stuff. ARM-based processors compress a lot of the instruction back and forth. The result was the CPU was always kind of slightly higher than some of the more beefy x86 options out there. So, for example, during the course of the testing, you may have noticed on many of the tests I kept the system resources on screen because I wanted to show the temperatures, but over the course of the testing, it sat around 68 to 76 degrees, depending on the complexity and the heavy write of the test. The heavier the write, the higher that temperature became. After 5 minutes after testing, in most cases, the temperature would then go down on that CPU to around 64 to 66 degrees. It didn't really go lower than that unless I left the system completely idle for about an hour. Now, after 24 hours, that 24-hour hourly test, the CPU would then average out around 50 to 60, because it had that extra time to come down lower, but then it would spark up when all of those backup and sync tasks were all happening there. Overall, the temperature seemed a little high, but once you factor in that it's an ARM, then that seems absolutely fine, because it kind of makes sense. Overall, for a rack mount, an 8-bay rack mount, all the numbers I've talked about today, with the exception of performance, and we'll get onto that at the moment, were pretty good. They're what I expected them to be. This is a more enhanced cooling system NAS. This is a rack mount that is designed because of that horizontal cooling system to really hammer the fans when it needs to. Hence why the noise level, unsurprising for a rack mount, may have been a little bit unbearable for some of you. But the performance, the big takeaway for me on performance was, regardless of synthetic or non-synthetic testing, the drives that I was using gave me as good as they could, but I was never able to fully saturate 10 GBE. What was really surprising was when I was using SSDs that only if I'd been able to tweak or use very specific file types or use truly synthetic testing beyond that of just the software, but also using very optimized client testing machines, would I have been able to saturate the 10 GBE on the SSDs? I do think it's possible, but in a domestic setting, absolutely not. And for that, to me, that is the big takeaway for me. If you're going to go for this, the big takeaway for this video is there is no point spending money on SSDs on this system. There just isn't. If you're going to go for SSD, this not only is this not a flash system, but you might think because this system's affordable at, you know, $799 and some of the other ones like the 4-bay being $499 means you should use that money and put it towards SSDs. I don't think you should. The internal architecture here is not going to give you the most out of SSDs that you want. It will give you consistency, but it won't give you peak performance. Ultimately, I still really like this device. I think UniFi have done a great job extending their portfolio, and nothing about the results to me even slightly indicate about this being missold for what it is. It is an incredible solution for its price point and its architecture. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did watch this all the way from the beginning to the end, please tell me in the comments, because videos like this I generally don't make because frankly they are as dull as dishwater for many of you, and in terms of YouTube's algorithm, they do not go down well. But do let me know in the comments. Now, if this video has been helpful to you, if this is the video that you watched that made you think, you know what, I might get a hold of one of those, please support this channel by using the links in the description. Using those links to get hold of any UniFi device, just click the link and then anything you buy on there results in a small commission to me and Eddie here at NAS Compares, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. It's a passive way to support creators where it costs you nothing extra, but just if this video helped you and you were going to go to the stores listed in the description anyway, use those links and we keep making videos like this. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.